I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do. So, where do monsters come from? To me, that's the essential question that most horror stories ask of us. Monsters either come from out there, which is the dark woods or some other version of the unknown, or monsters come from in here, our human hearts, our human minds. But the horror stories that are timeless know that the answer isn't so simple. It's not so cut and dry. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein has a scientist create a monster, but it also shows how the Industrial Revolution helped create that scientist and gave that scientist the choices, which therefore changed his life and the life of all of his family. The dehumanizing effect of rapid technology and the perversion of nature allows Victor Frankenstein to become both the monster and the monster maker. Hey, what can I say? It takes a village to make a monster. And great horror stories like Frankenstein have universal appeal, and artists can reinterpret them to reflect the anxieties of every generation. And on Friday, September 13th, a new take on the Frankenstein story will open in select cities and video on demand. The name of the film is Depraved. And my guest today is legendary independent horror writer, producer, and founder of Eye Pix, Larry Fessenden. Larry, thanks so much for being on the show.
Hey, man, it's great to be here.
Well, before we delve into the world of Depraved, I wanted to talk a little about your connection with the horror genre. I mean, because I said that you're the founder of Eye Pix, but saying the founder of Eye Pix feels like the understatement of the decade, because if we look at that, it means that you write and you direct your own films. You created a shingle to mass produce your films and get them out there and distribute them, but you also mentor and you've produced films for a large swath of artists, including Ty West and Jim Mickle and Mickey Keating and Jen Wexler. All have pretty much gone on to more films and have increased the stable of Eye Pix. You have award-winning audio plays, Tales from Beyond the Pale, several seasons of that. You and Graham Resnick wrote an award-winning video game, Until Dawn. There's also comic book versions of your stories and films. There's even soundtracks and there's swag. I even saw that there's a Wendigo model kit, which I'm going to have to see about grabbing because I love that thing. So anyway, this isn't a passing fancy, Larry. This is a real passion of yours. So what movie was it that got you on this path? What was your first kiss with horror, the movie that sent you down this road to ruin?
I appreciate you calling it The Road to Ruin. I wrote a song called Road to Ruin. Well, you know, I do believe that the first movie I ever saw was King Kong, which is sweet to recall. I was in a hotel at my grandfather's waiting for something, and I remember seeing that movie. But more generally, I grew up watching the old black and white Universal movies on chiller theater and that sort of thing. I was a child of the 70s. Television was the way that you saw movies in those days. You didn't have VHS, there was no DVD and so on. You could go to the theater, and I did as often as I could. I grew up in New York City, so I had that experience. But in general, a Saturday afternoon meant I could play hooky from going and exercising with my parents and stay home and watch Frankenstein, Dracula, and of course lots of much more marginal films like The Incredible Faceless Man and just all kinds of, you know, the Attack of the Crab Monsters, all kinds of really striking and imaginatively weird movies where you could see the zipper on the monster. And that was all part of my upbringing, sort of entering into the imagination that wasn't served up like a CGI movie where you stood in judgment of the monster. It was actually up to you to sort of participate in the creating of the fantasy because there was a certain amount of amateurness or low budget aspects. So I think that opened my heart to that. But I really grew up on those movies, and that's something I think I've tried to recapture with a more modern sensibility. Of course, I eventually did grow up, though some people will dispute that, and, you know, became a child of the 60s and 70s, much more difficult times and much more sense of realism and angst in our entertainments, for everything from Romero, of course, but then Scorsese. And so then I think the movies I make are trying to blend those two things, the affection I have for the horror tropes of the Universal movies, and the themes that I felt were vital, even as a kid, but I now need to bring those into a modern sensibility and use the techniques of a more contemporary filmmaking style to sort of bring to life again.
Yeah. You bring up some interesting points. And I grew up outside of Philadelphia. I was in Pennsylvania, and we're about the same age. You're a little older. I'll just say you're a little older, but
a little older,
yeah, just a little older. But I grew up watching WR TV 9 and all of that out of my area. You mentioned Chiller Theater. Was your horror host Zachary at that point, or did you have someone else?
Funny, I didn't have the horror host, and I'm aware of it more from those retrospective movies from the 80s where they set,
right.
Fright Night and so on. But Chiller, the main thing was that fantastic six-finger hand, Chiller. And so, and then the $1 Million movie, and then the 4:30 movie was the Godzilla stuff and so on. But I envy the kids that had the horror host and Elvira and so on. Right.
Mine wasn't enviable that much. I had a guy named Uncle Ted, Uncle Ted's Ghoul School. He was a bad magician with a fez. It was really not.
But how fantastic!
Oh,
really.
It was wonderful, and it really did capture an entire innocence that was happening at that point. Where I always say that a lot of what happens with art happens because the money makers haven't figured out where the holes are yet. So, like downtown, when you were growing up in Manhattan, you have punk happening because there's so much empty space. Everybody's gone from the white flight. Well, with cable, or before cable, when we had the horror hosts, it was because the affiliates only had like 3 hours of regular programming. They had to fill everything else up, and Universal was running out of money because of lawsuits, and they needed to sell that shock package. And across the country, everybody came up with the same idea. They put this thing out of all these movies, some of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And before you know it, you have a film school for guys like me. And I love that you mention that you had a different mindset coming in through the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, because I grew up when we were taught that film meant something, that it was really going to change things. People listened to Andrew Sarris. People listened to the critics of the time and their arguments about the auteur theory. And me being a kid, I loved horror films. I was like, why can't we use the same thing, the golden mean, on horror films? But of course, as you found out and then changed the game yourself, it normally was where the two did not meet. You weren't going to look at horror with the same kind of assessment that you would something larger. But what I love about your movies is that there is this wonderful mix. There is the old classic Universal horror monsters. In fact, the first 3 films that you have, your Frankenstein story, the Dracula story, and more or less the werewolf, the Wendigo. But as an artist, what's the appeal of the horror genre that draws you to tell your stories through it?
Well, I always say, and first of all, I'm just so delighted by your riff. I mean, I love the idea that we're actually, you and I, children of just a reality of marketing. They realized they could repackage the Universal movies, and then they made the Aurora monster models, and they came up with famous monsters of filmland. So we really are a product of our generation. And of course, what we did with it is disparate and many different responses, but we were, Count Chocula, which was the cereal and the Munsters. This really just a golden period in which those monsters were injected into our brains, and some of us took it seriously enough that we had to process it and then do something with it, and that's where someone like myself comes from, and obviously you're still haunted by it as well.
Yes.
But why horror? I mean, I always say the same thing. I was wired for horror as a kid. I think, I came from a comfortable background, but I think I had the intelligence to recognize that that was unusual and that it was a fragile thing. I was always possessed by the potential in the moment for something to, if you will, go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I didn't have tragedy in my life, but I felt it all around, the potential. And I think it's just sort of a way that you perceive life. And I think if you're a sensitive kid, you feel the little microaggressions around you.
Yes.
I had two brothers that would fight. Once again, I'm not claiming any of this was as dire as so many people's upbringing. In fact, I think the mundanity of it is something to analyze. I'll leave it to a shrink somewhere. And then, you know, the 60s were also tough. You saw there was the Vietnam War. You saw that there was actually real crisis around us. And that's why Romero was so profound, because he tapped into that. And I remember seeing Night of the Living Dead. It was black and white. It was on television. I saw it as a kid. It was, you know, at 1 a.m. or something. The parents were asleep, and I was like, oh, cool. Another, you know, seemed like a graveyard opening.
Right.
But it slowly encroached on my mind that this was different. There was something very dark, and this was not going to go well for these characters. It wasn't a universal picture. So that was a seminal experience. And I think where I realized, oh, horror has real power to it. So yeah, I think it's just a very personal thing. I think people respond differently. I always liked the creaky branches, the full moon. You know, I would get scared of the dark. I thought there were creatures in the closet. I mean, so there are just as many people. When I made my film Wendigo, the fun thing was working with the actor Andrew Pear Sullivan. I really had to explain to him how scary the child was supposed to feel.
Right.
And he just didn't innately have that sensibility. So I think it's very personal. And I always say I make scary movies because I'm trying to make people feel the way I feel, you know, have that relationship to reality. I'm always acutely aware of death. I think this is a culture that is too afraid to address reality.
Yeah.
They can't talk about death in America. In fact, there's a lot of denial that I find very frustrating. And always did. And, you know, as you referenced punk rock and white flight and all the things that were happening in the city, in New York, and just in our culture. And a lot of my response is also an anger at the sort of the lies and the sense of denial. I was going to call Habit denial, actually, because I was looking for whatever. I love these one-word titles, which sort of allow the audience to interpret the movie through a word or a notion. And denial was one of the things. I mean, the guy's an alcoholic. Yeah. And so he's not really admitting his real problems. And so those are the things that interest me. I still feel like my movies are haunted by those themes of like kind of a wake up America kind of attitude.
Right. And I think now that we're so hooked in, I think it's Wake Up World. I seem to see this, instead of a European sensibility coming to America, it seems like there's more of an American sensibility happening in areas of Europe, which is kind of strange. And I'm not.
Well, we have responsibilities as our culture.
Yeah.
And like the only import we have, the only export we have is our movies and our sensibility. And the sad thing is that in the positive way, that's the idea of democracy and all the sort of fantasies. I don't believe any of it was ever entirely real, but you still putting out an idea still has value. And that's what America was about for, I don't know, a century or something. And when you lose that, you're like, well, really, what are we about then?
Right. So No Telling is a Frankenstein story. Habit is Dracula. Wendigo, more or less, the werewolf. You have a trilogy of the universal monsters, and each of those are obviously rather iconic. We've just gone on about their importance there, and they're really mythological. So we just talked about how America, all it has is an export of a myth, and how that gets seen is the eyes of the beholder. But what about making myths yourself? What was so compelling about these icons that come with a mythology already built into them that you wanted to make new myths with them, with your films?
Well, I wanted to, in a way, assert that those myths were important and they were still relevant. You know, there's the notion, if you just take Frankenstein, for example, never mind Depraved, but just in general, that people would say, oh, that's an old crusty movie, the Boris Karloff, that's cute. And, worked in the old days, but we've moved on. We're a more modern situation. But I sort of wanted to say, oh no, but you don't understand. There's so much validity there. And I mean, I'm the kind of person that even as a parent, but as a friend, I often love to state the obvious and just sort of remind people, because I think we sort of like that classic cliche, standing on the backs of giants. I think sometimes people, and this is my resentment towards the Twitter generation, there's sort of an assumption that everything is at this level, and now we have to really deal with the new, the atrocious. What am I saying? The insults of the day, but people aren't really sort of getting back to the fundamental reality. So, in other words, it's not like I've plotted this out, but in analyzing what interests me, I like sort of reminding people of the value of the cliche, not the value of it, but the why it is resilient and important, in a sense.
Well, I say that about horror a lot. People will say, "Oh, I'm so tired of the horror tropes," or that there's, and I'm like, "No, you're tired of the cliches." And all you have to do is make new cliches. You don't throw out an entire genre because of the cliches. So these are cliches because
Hitchcock
they were
said
important.
that too.
Yeah,
exactly. Hitchcock always said, avoid the cliche at all costs, but he knew well that you still are telling the story of a murder.
Right.
How do you make that interesting and different and surprise the audience and so on? So it is the idea of revitalizing. It's a way also philosophically of saying, lean in, pay attention. Mm-hmm. Don't just dismiss something because you think you've seen it before. That's like to say, and that's why I wasn't very articulate about the Twitter business, but I'm just saying this kind of assumption that you get it.
Right.
I've already gotten it, and I'm furthermore going to comment on it, and I have all this to say. But it's like, let's actually just back off and say, what is and that also comes from the sort of the ponder the lilies idea. Take a moment, reflect on your day, because the other thing is you want to say life is precious. Don't take things for granted. You're very lucky you're not in the Bahamas right now, or you're not at the border getting in a cage. And, look, life is, the people in misfortune. So it's back to what I was saying. When I was a kid, I was just aware, in a sense, that I was lucky. Yeah. And that can be taken from you. And that's, I loved your introduction. You spoke about horror. There's the natural horror, like the Jaws or the... Backcountry is a great movie. The Bear Attack.
Magnificent.
There's a whole group of movies that I love, Open Water, that are about, this uncontrollable, like you're just vulnerable to to nature and monsters I want to see crawl. I'm looking forward to that, and so on and so on. So that's a whole genre that I adore. Then there's, and it's sort of related, the slasher genre, where you're just in your house and then there's somebody, home invasion, that whole vibe. Henry Serial Killer, there's any number of great. And then there's sort of the Wolfman, Jekyll and Hyde, sort of the more struggling with, it's exactly your intro. I really appreciated that. And these are the different levels of horror, and all of them are addressing essential human conditions, both the randomness of violence, the violence that we bring on ourselves, self-betrayal, and all of those issues. Anyway, so it's just a very rich genre, and not to be
not to be trifled. Yeah.
Yes, not to be trifled. Hello.
That's right. So I have to say that the first film that I saw of yours was Habit, and I saw, I believe, if IFC had put it out. And what I tell people all the time, and what I also say is, you get talked about a lot at horror conventions. In case you don't know that, you may know that, but yeah, you're one of those guys that when we bring up movies that we think are important over the last 20 years or so, your films constantly come up because they are unique from what we normally see. And I think a lot of times horror fans are a lot more sophisticated than they're given credit for. There are
Absolutely.
people who certainly will be more than happy to just watch something that is very obvious, but there are a lot of people who really go for anything that has a little bit more depth to it. And I will say that Habit and Guillermo del Toro's Cronos for the 90s pretty much saved the 90s horror phenomenon, because they started moving everything to thriller after Silence of the Lambs. Silence of the Lambs is magnificent, but it getting so much attention just turned everything into thrillers and psychological thrillers for some reason. Or horror films became self-referential. And what I think really hit me about Habit was that it took horror seriously. You showed that classic horror grounding, but you grounded it in real life. And so it really felt rather personal. It felt very much of a time. I mean, we live as we dream alone, I believe, is one of the really important lines that's in that film. And so Sam was really impressive to me as well, because a little bit of backstory. I was about 2 years away. I had finished drinking about 2 years before Habit had come out, and what I saw out of Sam was a fully developed character that wasn't Days of Wine and Roses, wasn't this obvious thing, wasn't leaving Las Vegas. Here was a guy that was kind of what I knew, which was helpful. He wanted to be helpful, but he's lost, and he's slowly slipping away. And he's like every junkie is a setting sun. He's kind of fading in that fashion. So it's interesting that he's like the setting sun, and a vampire appears into his life. And so a vampire entering someone's life may not seem like it's that personal, but illusion of loneliness, isolation, paranoia. What were you working through? First off, were you? It's none of my business. Was there anything personal that you were trying to work out through the metaphor and allegory of horror with this kind of story?
Well, listen, I think alcoholism is obviously a very real thing, and I wanted to portray. I discussed earlier the idea of denial, and I think in our society, whether you're literally a drunk, there's this tendency to try to escape. So I really wanted to make a portrait of that kind of personality and the kind of grief that he's dealing with. Like, it's one thing to say you're a drunk, but why? And in that movie, I have him really feeling lost from his father. He has a disconnection from the father figure, and it's discussed in various ways. And then, he can't deal with he's losing his girlfriend, and he's just dysfunctional. So it's a portrait of that kind of person. I mean, the thing I tend to ask when I make these movies is like, we talked about growing up with those iconic stories, but I love saying, what would it really be like, if you met a vampire? And then, really writing a script just with asking those questions. And one thing you say is like, who would meet a vampire? And it's somebody who's already open or susceptible to self-delusion, and to a certain degree to fantasy explanation of life. Like, you're lying to yourself. If you're a drinker and you've sort of lost control, you're making excuses every day. And that's the whole idea between Habit. When I wrote the story originally, I had written in 1981, I was thinking about the title, and I told you one of them was denial, and one of them was the hunger. And one of them was addiction. I mean, I know you think I'm making it up, but those are sort of actually the logical titles when you're sort of dealing in this world, because it wasn't the name. It wasn't going to be Anna. I don't like movies that use name titles unless it's Dracula.
Nadja.
And Nadja. Fucking Nadja. All those movies ruined my life because they were all quite popular right when my movie was finished. But the point is that, no, I chose instead Habit. Just something incremental. The little teeny shocks. And that's what I'm, maybe we'll get to Depraved. And the idea is like the little psychological shocks that actually create the person. It's easy to say, oh, well, they suffered from this terrible trauma when they were a child, and that's why they're the way they are. But I'm more interested in the little things that happen that form character. And, they're less defined, but actually I think they're more common to regular folks who aren't going through, the trauma, when that's a whole other thing to deal with, and certainly to be taken seriously. But, most people are experiencing these things, and they're being shaped and formed and traumatized in very subtle ways. So it was habit, not the addiction.
Right.
That was the distinction. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
Huh.
I loved that Roger Ebert said, the portrait of the alcoholic was so startlingly honest or whatever. And he was a drinker himself, I happen to know. And therefore, I think he responded to that theme in the movie. And I was portraying something that I still know quite well, that sort of weird living on the edge.
Yeah.
Where you're kind of skating through it.
Well, everything about the way that you make your films is really intriguing to me, including titles. You mentioned habit. You're saying habit, and I'm seeing the font, that the artistry of how the name is written, and how all of your movies, No Telling, has a very interesting font look, and even the end credits are painted with drawings, and so it's as if the whole movie has an artistry to it that is unique. And I wanted to talk very quickly about that before we head right into Depraved, which is some of the things that I think were very interesting, like looking at your films, and I mean, Habit's just one that really was amazing on this kind of thing. It felt like a New Yorker horror version of Rome Open City. I mean, you had this thing of like everything felt stolen. There was like this huge energy. There were obviously people that were in the film that were not actors. They were people who were found for the moment. You just stumbled upon things, and it felt very vibrant, like what Rossellini was doing with Rome Open City. So it's almost like Italian neorealism meets horror. And you grew up in the 70s and 80s. So I'm wondering, were you influenced by like Amos Poe and Nick Zed and, the no wave cinema movement? Because there's this really down to the ground and take off and run kind of feel to your filmmaking.
Well, I appreciate it. Somebody like Nick Zed and Amos Poe, I mean, I feel like we were to some degree contemporary, so I wasn't being influenced by them. I think we were all aware of the freedom brought about by the neo-realists, everything all the way back to, The Bicycle Thief. But just the idea that the cameras, could hit the street, low-level lighting. My movie Habit was made on a new ASA 500T. 500T was like new, could see in the dark practically. So that allowed us to film in the streets, and available light would actually give you a beautiful image. Frank DeMarco shot the movie. So this is what I've been saying, I love the classic tropes, but I wanted to bring a vitality and an immediacy. And that was going on with movies in general. Easy Rider and all the movies from the 70s had a much more street found footage vibe. And that was really, I grew up on Godard, and it's one of the tragedies of, whatever. There's so much great stuff now. I'm not really complaining, but I'm saying that there was a movement towards authenticity. That was how you would fight the man, by telling the truth. And, when you speak about, the alcoholism and habit or any of those things, the mission, and I would like to say I'm still trying to do that, is to tell the truth, to give something. The one thing Hollywood can't do is offer genuine vulnerability. And that's something that a low-budget filmmaker still has access to. No one can tell my story more truthfully than myself. That's the one thing I have. No budget can trump, if I could use the word, that simple impulse and that reality. So it is about a certain kind of authenticity that you can bring, but then to these gothic stories. And that's what becomes so delicious, because the audience is oriented to like, oh, I know, this is how this story is going to go. He's going to try to escape, and then the vampire, and there's going to be garlic, and there's going to be steaks. Well, yeah, you deliver that, and you're like, wow, but I'm in a dialogue because I know that this guy started in a normal movie, and yet I'm experiencing this weird disconnect. And I really feel like, in a way, that's reality. You're dealing with big stories, big ideas, big talk, democracy, in America, this and that, all this sort of highfalutin stuff. And then you deal with the actual reality of it. So that dichotomy is what I think I'm trying to do, but using something fun. I mean, who wants to see a movie about alcoholism, for example?
Right.
No, I need a vampire in there to sweeten the deal. And on it goes, So
I think that's one of the
the
great
vibe.
things, that level of abstraction that horror allows us to be able to talk about things that are very, very upsetting, but have
Absolutely.
that be the boogeyman that we don't want to talk about. We have a boogeyman with a cape or whatever we would so want. And it's interesting because there is so much of a sense of true vulnerability in your films, especially Depraved. I must say, Depraved had me, I've watched it 3 times going, well, maybe this time I won't be sorrowful. No, I get sadder
Sorry.
every time I watch the damn thing. And it's like I'm watching a horror film that makes me very sad. But I mean, you have the ability to pull that kind of reality of regret from this situation. Yet it's kind of a movie that's in magical realism. I mean, you have this very realistic feel, and then what has been with your films from the beginning, no telling, but definitely Wendigo, where you have almost a feel like the Quay brothers, or the Jan Svanemacher, or Stan Breckenridge, or Stan Brackridge, the guy who did the experimental films like
Of course.
Mothlight, I think was the one that I looked up because I was going, this thing with the veins, it feels like something much more natural. So I guess, how do you work on that kind of experimentalism and balance that with reality when you're trying to do movies like this? How do you know when you've gone too far, or you don't care?
No, well, you don't. But listen, I do want to go back to earlier when you spoke about the graphics, and that's all my wife, Beck Underwood.
Yes.
She's a artist, and we're pals most of the time, and she does all those beautiful logos. And there is something about, there's a handcrafted vibe to my films, which comes from trying to assert a whole other type of art. And it is, I appreciate everyone you've referenced, Svankmajer, Quay brothers, and actually Brackage. For Depraved, a lot of the visuals, we were trying to conceive of how to make the idea of the brain and the mechanisms of the brain, put that on the screen. And, one of them was the mesmerizing rhythms of Stan Brackage's movie. So I appreciate your seeing that, because it's one of the references. And the Quay brothers, I love animation and little objects and bringing them to life. And there's a childish vibe to that, which I, once again, like a vulnerability. I embrace that. I project that. I'm not ashamed of that. I'm still like a kid. And that's why I have sort of enthusiasm for you keep saying you can do this, let's go make a movie, kids. It's an absurd naivete, especially in this crushing business. So you need to have that. And I don't mind leading with that and putting it out there and letting people sort of feed on it and react to it. Some people are dismissive, and that's fine. It may be why I'm not taken seriously in the industry. But at the same time, I know that I'm providing a kind of a sense of a playground for people to be creative and so on. I mean, Guillermo del Toro says that, an artist's job is in a way to retain their childhood, their childish dreams, their childish experience, and their wonderment. So that's what's going on. And, I really love using animation and handcrafted aspects, even in these so-called naturalistic dramas. That's the other thing. So it's a bit of a soup. But I also feel that, surrealism and all those things which we associate as different artistic movements, well, the reality is that they're all speaking about perception. And in Depraved, I had the perfect opportunity, because the trope from the movie series from Universal, and then therefore in the Hammer movies, and basically everything except Mary Shelley, was this notion of getting a brain and putting it in a body, and that becomes the essence of the creature. And in the most simplistic way from the old movies, and of course abnormal, is the idea that the brain is a criminal brain, and that's why the monster's the monster. I mean, that's a pretty lame conceit that really was part of the Universal storyline. However, if you do think about the brain transplant, then you get into the issues of identity and perception, and you get into an incredibly interesting, sort of hard to even describe discussion of cognition, how the brain works, where is identity. You get into the storylines of Oliver Sacks, who wrote about brain trauma and how people's personality were completely randomly different. Like if parts of their brain were dead due to an accident or something, they would now no longer remember 2 minutes ago, or they would think their wife was a flagpole. I mean, all this crazy shit. And you're like, wow, you mean, so it's really all just in the physicality of the brain, the synapses. And then you say, well, okay, so that's a really interesting idea. How do I show synapses? And then you get into like, oh, well, there's whole filmmakers who are using movie imagery to do something very different from telling a story in a strict way, a narrative way. And you're like, I'll use their stuff, bring it into my narrative, and then I'll have this thing where I'll be thinking about the imagistic experience of life. So much about perception, and that's why you can make a movie that has everything from animation to children's dreams or children's drawings. And so I insist on the largest swath. The other thing, quite simply, is you only get to make a movie now and again, no matter who you are and whatever your, it just takes a long time and a lot of money raising and a lot of glad handing. And the fact is just, I always want to throw everything into every movie I make. And I said on Depraved in particular, this is about the history of the world. And I would say it to my crew and they'd all roll their eyes. I'd say, this movie is about electricity. It is about the brain. And, it is about the history of art. No, I'm sorry. It is about, and it was a goof, but there was part of me that was saying, that's the point. Frankenstein is about everything. Yeah. That's what's cool about it.
Yeah, I completely agree. In fact, I have written down notes. I'm like, boy, it could be several themes that I read that were inside of Depraved. And I don't want to give away too much. So for people who are listening that are going to run out to see this on Friday or watch it on VOD, can you give a brief synopsis that you feel comfortable with to tell what the story is?
Well, it couldn't be more cliche. It's Frankenstein. I mean, I don't call it Frankenstein. There's one reference to it, which is similar to
Frankenstein of the Hudson.
Movie Habit. He says Frankenstein of the Hudson, and you kind of go, oh, so they realized what they were doing this whole time. Because you wouldn't build a person in a Brooklyn loft and bring him to life and not be aware that, I mean, it's funny when you make a movie where they understand everything is real except that Frankenstein didn't exist. That would be one way to do an adaptation of Frankenstein. Right. And that just seems absurd in the modern world. So Frankenstein exists in this movie and he references it at a certain point. But just like in Habit, the guy says vampire like 3/4 through the movie. Right. He says, like, let me get it straight. Are you saying that your girlfriend is a vampire? Vampire. Yeah, vampire. So similarly, in this one, it's referenced once. But the bottom line is, so it starts as one story. It's a couple. It's almost like I like to say it's like a mumblecore movie, Joe Swanberg. It's just a young couple there bitching after sex, and she's excited to talk about children, and he's like, I can't deal with this, and he says, let me get out of here, but I'll see you tomorrow. He goes out, comes to an unfortunate end. There's the random violence. So we talked about the different tropes in horror. Well, I'm terrified, and I think it's so fun to shake up an audience with something so random. There's just no explanation. And then you get into issues of God and, why me and all that, which is a topic of sorts. Then he wakes up and he's the monster. I'm not giving too much away. That's 7 minutes in. Yeah. But then you're just dealing with him trying to remember who he was, and he has to deal with his father figure, who's the doctor, and it follows the trajectory of Frankenstein oddly closely. I hardly had the book open when I wrote it. I really didn't. I had read the book maybe twice in my life, or I think more honestly, once and a half. Right. Kind of, and it's notoriously not. There's a version of it with a Stephen King introduction, and I love that he says, "Now listen, kids. This isn't what you think, but stick by it. It's really cool." Right. But, the fact is that Frankenstein, the book, is a much more contemplative literary endeavor. Yeah. And that was always this sort of challenge because you wanted to read the story about the Karloff monster, but right. It's not to be found. It's better than Brahms. I mean, Dracula is dry as toast. At least Frankenstein is. Toast. Yeah. Although the cool thing about Dracula is the end in Coppola's version is is one of the only times that they go back to the castle. And that's why I love Coppola's version. It's one of the few movies I would want to re-edit because I do love it, but it's so flawed and aggravating.
Yeah.
But I love the return to the castle. And I mean, I would have made that longer and the whole exchange outside. But both Frankenstein and Dracula, speaking of, well, we weren't speaking of it, but let me bring up a topic. Structure. What's interesting is they're written by letters within letters within letters.
Yes.
So in a strange way, they are structured with the idea of different narratives. And the nature of my film is that you're one person for a portion of the movie, then you're someone else, and then you keep changing perspectives, and it's just my ongoing interest in subjectivity.
Yeah, it's really intriguing because, like you said, it's strangely accurate to the book, including the thing of like having Frankenstein being built in a warehouse loft in Brooklyn. The book, I don't think it's a castle, if I remember correctly. It was like a small place as well. You know, he was like in a cabin or an apartment, basically the equivalent of an apartment. Right. And in Habit, it starts with the Demeter, right? The boat coming in.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you realizing that. Yeah.
All of those things, and I see it through the film. The woman that he picks up, our main character Adam picks up at the bar is kind of like a little girl from the Karloff movie. So you're mixing it.
She has daisies. If you look closely,
I didn't notice that.
Little daisies on her dress, which is honestly, dude, I just did the commentary and it's so layered that it's almost I can't even go on. But let me be the first to tell you. So she has these daisies on her dress. Her name is Shelley, and yes, there's an innocence to their relationship that evokes Karloff and the little girl and the daisy and that whole thing. But there's also a picture of Mary Shelley in a bodice with daisies. So it's like it's a hat on a hat. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I love when your film has the ability to walk both lines. So what's interesting is so many of us know the Karloff ideals, don't realize that it begins in the snow and they find Victor and it ends in the snow, chasing after this thing in the ice. I mean, only people who have read it would know that. They wouldn't know that he murders, he kills the young William, if I remember correctly, the cousin or the nephew.
Cousin, and then they hang the maid or whatever for that crime, which is really bleak.
Yeah, very bleak. So I love how you have parts of that, the book itself, really there, but you also give, like even the brain thing, you give the universal piece, and you meld that together rather well. I guess this is your second official exploration of the Frankenstein story, the first one being No Telling. And I'll tell you, I watched No Telling again. Boy, that one hurts so much at the end. I don't know how most people respond, but that whole dog moment is so painful. And it just really hammers home this megalomania of science going too far, which seems like, the first film, No Telling, is fueled by this moral outrage. But then, and the scientist is the antagonist, right? But that's not where we are with Depraved. 30 years later, more sorrowful. It's tinged with regret. We feel for both the monster and the creator. There's an outside force that's bringing it. And it almost feels like, I want to say that it's probably not a good reading, but when I was watching, the first moment that we see Adam wake up on the chair and we see the ceiling from his point of view, and there's like these garage lights that are hooked together. That's the lab, right? He's using things that I might light a film with if I had $2.
That's it.
And he puts his hand up, and what I thought of was how ludicrous that it's in a Brooklyn loft and everything, and he's got these lights. How could this possibly work? And then it made me think of the regret of innovation gone wrong, because it made me think of Hewlett-Packard. It made me think of these garages where all these guys build this. And I started getting on this thing that I couldn't let go of because of the puzzles and some of the things that are said about Adam, that it felt like, a good idea that falls apart, even with the best of intentions, because the culture is changing, the environment is changing, and every choice that you make is affecting that. And it almost feels like You were making a eulogy about, Shelley is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, right? And you're basically coming in with Depraved saying, well, that revolution's over. The Silicon Revolution is over. We don't have any more revolutions. So here we are. And this is how the world goes with a whimper. And so there is this sorrow that is to the story. Is that intentional?
Well, I think the melancholy is ultimately just an expression of my own exhaustion with human enterprise and human hubris, just constantly sort of sputtering out and leading to not our betterment. And, that is the whole point of Frankenstein, at least the way I portray it. The difference in between my version and Mary Shelley's and various other versions is the doctor's repulsed and horrified by the monster in the traditional storyline. In mine, he's like, okay, I'm going to try, but he's really not. This isn't what
he's not a good father.
Yeah, he didn't really realize, damn, I got to deal with this now. And he's wetting his pants and he's just like, oh God, this is really going to be starting from zero. And so I think my point is like, listen, technology, whatever, I'm not condemning technology, but all this invention and enterprise comes with strings and responsibilities. And, if you're not willing to follow through and deal with that, then maybe you should, I'm not really telling people what to do, but I'm just observing that, there are consequences. And there are unintended consequences to all of our tinkering. And I like your reference. A lot of people have observed that it has that Silicon Valley vibe because it is so, whatever that expression, gum and right. Anyway, it's clearly just, but that also derived from the very reality that this kind of doctor could do that because he came from, he was a field medic in Afghanistan. And the idea is, if you look at those tents, you're just like, oh my God, it's just so dirty. It's so spontaneous. They just throw it up. They've got lights. Some of the lights that are in Depraved are the exact lights they have. They're these kind of, quick, industrial. You go to Home Depot and, that gets you going and you got your power over here and you just need your gauze and you're that. So they were also inspired just about like our technologies, our medical technologies are so impressive. We can bring people to life in essence on the battlefield. And then what is that quality of life? So constantly it's saying, and as I say, people think my movies are moralizing or that I have an agenda and I'm trying to tell people what to do. No, I'm just saying, let's look, this is back to what I was earlier pointing out. I'm just saying, let's just look at this again. How? Okay, great. So we can do this. But what are we going to do with that? Right. It's like obviously modern technologies, the iPhone and so on. Okay, so we can tweet and we can do this, but how's it all going for us? Can we step back for a minute and I think about, I don't have a thing for Twitter right now, but I am going to bring it up. It's like, we act like Twitter is part of nature. Like, actually you could tell Donald, dude, you're off. You're off the damn platform. Right. Or, the other thing is like they're trying to constantly hook us up. So absolutely everything you do can be online. And I'm like, guys, have you not lived through a blackout? Right. You act like this shit is going to just last forever. The minute it doesn't work, you're screwed. If you have lost the mechanism to live in the real world, you're just completely dependent. And can I remind you that there's like 3 corporations that are doing all of this. Right. And God love them and bless them for allowing us our day and our tweets and our texts. But the fact is like you cannot forget that this is just a tiny little sliver of reality. And I really, if I do want to get lectury, I just want people to remember. And then you come back to like the old cliches. The only thing that matters is our relationship to each other, our respect, our dignity, working, having a system that works through kindness and you know what I'm saying. And that's the function of the character Liz in the movie. Yes. She keeps saying that throughout. And of course, who gets the most horrible end? Well, she does, because that's humanity. Even the monster who we're supposedly kind of feel sorry for, he falls into the whole thing and ends up killing the one nice person. Sorry, spoiler alert, but it's also in the freaking book. It's in every version. Well, maybe not. Obviously, in Karloff, she doesn't get killed. But the bottom line is the woman's going to come under some duress. It's the way these stories are told. It's humanity. Look at the Me Too generation. It's there for a reason. Right. So that's the thing. But I would argue that it's not even just a male-female thing. It's just that she represents kindness, measured, and it's almost like it's not for this world. We have such an aggressive world that we've built.
I think that's something that's really interesting about your take too. And it's in several of your films. There's a couple things that are in this film that add to the tragedy. And I think in Habit, there's the moment where Sam is about to get all the information from the guy that feels like he's out of a Roman Polanski film, and nobody hits he doesn't get the voice message, and he never hears. So the life raft is never found. And in this, we have that communication, that text. That is it Alex, the first, when he's young and he's still alive in the very beginning of the movie, he's Alex, and he's writing thank you for the necklace, and he never gets to send it. He's killed right there. And then when he finds the phone and he plugs it in, it calls her immediately, and he can't speak to her. And I'm like, that's so painful. And that's part of some of the pain that there is in this film. There's this constant tinge of regret. And, you mentioned this idea of, technology not being part of nature and things. And what I think I really felt in this version, I mean, when you first come into it, you think you're going to know, it's going to be a conspiracy, a big pharma, and it's much less than that. It's much more realistic than something like that. It ends up being, this neglect, this desperation. And there's a book that I just read, called The Next Pandemic by Ali Khan. He worked for the CDC for 25 years. And one of the things that he talked about was how good intentions and forward thinking sometimes cause grave damage. And he talks about the Congo, Belgian Congo, and the Congolese after that, where they started having smallpox, huge outbreaks of smallpox, and they couldn't figure out what was happening. And what it ended up being was they were burning sugar cane fields. And the government said, that does it. We're getting too much pollution. We're just going to stop doing that. And in not doing anything, they just let it go. The cane fields grew, and the rats and all sorts of other vermin got together. And that was the food source for poverty-laden folk. So they were eating this thing that got out of control on a good intention. And it took forever for them to find that. And I couldn't help but feel that there was a certain bit here where our main character, our Victor Frankenstein, who's actually Henry, like the movie, has this desire to do all the right things. He wants to put Jack back together on the battlefield. He has this PTSD, so he's willing to allow sight unseen, not ask any questions, get me the body parts, get me the drugs, and I will put someone together, and that will be worth it. And it all turns into this thing of, as I think Liz says, pain and death. So I have to applaud where you ended up going with that. What do you feel you wanted the audience, once they watch this film, what do you want them to walk out of the movie with? Because there seems to be a lot of stuff going on in this film.
Yeah, I just did a press day, and people asked that, and it's funny. Then
let's not ask it. Let's go somewhere else.
No, I mean, but what I find interesting is that it's a tough. My answer is to make people or to invite people to lean in and just think about the implications of all these different things. So it's not like The Last Winter is a film I made, and even there, I'm not really saying global warming is bad. That's the takeaway. But I'm saying that personal relationships are complex. Some of the most, in The Last Winter, the more exciting, dynamic character is Wrong, but we're drawn to him.
Yes.
And by Wrong, I mean he is bombastic, inspiring. He's a real leader. But is he leading down the wrong path? Mm-hmm. And, so it's sort of to your point, like Henry is trying to make up for the mistakes on the battlefield. He's trying to save like one person with this sort of technology, and he seizes on Polidori's willingness to fund it.
Polidori, yes.
And it's all a little goes wrong. That's the moral. The moral isn't really like, never build a man in your loft, or really for that matter, that Big Pharma is wrong. Because what I'm trying to say, I think, but my point then is, it's these little motivations. It's back to the title Habit. It's the little motivations that shape a person, the little shocks that make someone ultimately lose their way. The monster becomes aware of the aggression in his parents, so to speak, the two men, in the rivalry. You realize that Polidori's motivations is that he feels inadequate and jealous of Henry's brilliance. And so he both supports him and wants to bring him down. My favorite line from him is when he says, you couldn't have done this without me.
Yeah.
I was there in the room. And you just realize, like, this little small pettiness, he just feels that somehow, and once again, in our political system, there's this like, all those people just seem to think they know what's going on. I'm going to prove them wrong, even if it kills me.
Right.
There's this vindictiveness to the little people. And then the people aspiring to brilliance are flawed and taking us down maybe the wrong path. So it's really just saying humanity is a shit show. And the takeaway is just be more present and think. I don't know. I'm not telling people what to do. That's my observation about life.
Yeah. What I think is really interesting as well, that I really applaud, is most of the time when a movie is trying to get a theme across, you'll get these really interesting lines of dialogue from the protagonist. Right. The antagonist in your films tend to say all the really interesting things, the things that are the closest to the truth. So Polidori says the choices we make define the man. He says modernity encroaches 20th century angst, God is dead, and we're left alone with our technology and our nightmares. It sounds to me like he's you saying something like this while he's writing.
But it's funny you say that, because what I like about that character, he also says something that's so brutal at the end. He says, well, companionship is overrated.
Yes.
And you're like, oh, what a horrible perspective. But that comes from a lonely person,
right,
who's never had a connection. And the whole point of Polidori is, yes, he speaks all those truths, but he's bitter.
Yes.
And he doesn't have the generosity of heart. So,
and he's desperate.
There's nothing more frightening than a person who's maybe smart enough to know this stuff, but not big-hearted enough to wield it in any positive way. I mean, I think that is depraved.
Yeah.
Is sort of having the resources of humanity's incredible wealth of knowledge, but applying it wrong. It's like that whole is depraved. And I think that's where our culture is going to, and that is my condemnation. That's why it's a sad movie where it's just hopeless. Just like the monster. In the end, the monster's a monster. He killed Liz.
Yeah.
He can never go back. He can't have that girlfriend, even if he said, listen, I know I don't look the same, but honestly, no, he's a bad person now. He succumbed. And I love Polidori also says, we gave you life, but you squandered it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's brutal. That comes from, as you say, the villain. But that's true. Like, there's some version in which the character we most poignantly related to, the monster, who's a victim of circumstances, I don't know. Did he fuck up? So I don't know.
That's really cool. What I have to say is that final sequence of the monster running through that grove or orchard, absolutely beautiful and chilling, and how that's equally sad and beautiful. It's one of those horrible, beautiful moments. And there's
chased by German shepherds. There's an imagery
big dogs.
For that.
Yeah.
But, enough said, but.
And the acting of the three leads was really great. I mean, spending as much time, because obviously your budget, it seems like your budget was probably rather chopped at some point, because But because, of course, when you're doing an independent film and one that has a lower budget, dialogue and that kind of exposition and people working together, two men in a thing, is the production value. And it was so strong. How much you feel for these characters. And Josh Leonard, I was really kind of amazed. I was amazed at being able to take a character that could have been so one-sided and make me feel bad for him towards the end. I mean, really, some of that was the situational bit. One of the things that I think really I respond to, and I'm not sure if this is about environment, sense of place. All of your movies have the sense of place is the location is another character, and it affects the characters, the main characters, in some way. A lot of times your characters are running to a new place, in Wendigo or No Telling, or even in Habit, he's trying to hide and isolate, and yet the city won't allow him. He's gonna have this encroaching. What do you feel is the what you're trying to say about nature? Because what I noticed is that there's symbols of rebirth, the caduceus, but a lot of like a tattoo of trees with branches. That end of the movie with the grove of really interesting branches of the trees. You're taking pictures of VLA in the lungs and the brain synapses, and they're all getting like a collage at one point, like nature and the mind and electricity, all of that is combined. Can you tell me a little bit about what you think about nature? Sometimes I feel that the nature is a supernatural in your films.
Right. I just feel, I'm deeply religious for nature, what's actually there, what is awe-inspiring. And I am so bitter that we've created, and my movies are about mythologies, and false ones and real ones. And, Wendigo in particular addresses it directly. The father says to the kid, people make up stories to explain reality. And that is my position. And my feeling is like nature is this completely awe-inspiring. I'm sorry, is that not enough? Or do you need a guy with a white beard who's vengeful and bitter and always like meddling in your daily business and telling what gays should be doing? I'm sorry, is that really... So you really just want a father figure. You're just looking for a daddy. You cannot actually step back and look at a cloud and with great awe and respect say, there is something bigger than me, and yet I am also one with this beautiful universe. I'm so bitter I'm going to start fucking weeping or spitting. You see, this is to me what the movies are all about. It's like, why do we have these false gods when nature is so fantastic? And I appreciate you mentioned the lungs and the branches, and what I'm saying is that, look, it's all one. It's all so beautiful. Fractals, it's all this branching, and the monster, when he looks at the wall where Henry has put up these things, I hope that, well, there's one viewing of it where you're just like making your own connections. You're going, lightning is just like a lung, which is just like a river, which is just like a tree branch. And, in a way, that's just a moment of reverence. And it's because the monster is open to everything. And so he's able to make those associations. And it's back to this sort of theme for our conversation, is that I want people to just recognize the obvious. It's right there. But we're so shielded by our mythologies and our constructs and our phones and our Twitters and our opinions and our left wing, right wing, all of this, that we can't see these fundamental, beautiful, unifying truths that would bring us all together and help us sort of solve the problems of the world, if I could be utopian for a second. But that's what I'm raging against. All my stories are about all the things that are blocking us from the fucking obvious, which is literally that mythologies are just a little thing we cling to. Let's analyze them. Let's enjoy them. Yes, a centaur. Look, there's a centaur coming into the room. It's fantastic. Oh, there's a Wendigo. Oh, well. Ooh. But the fact is, Frankenstein. It's like,
yes.
It's so silly. It's like, it's all great, but they're just stories. That's my point, actually.
Well, that's wonderful because that's another thing that I feel a connection. When I was young, I stole an Alfred Hitchcock book, Spellbinders and Suspense, out of my library. And one of the stories in it was the Wendigo, Algernon Blackwood. Mm-hmm. And I became a fan for life of what Algernon Blackwood was doing, which is between that and the Willows and a few others.
He's my absolute favorite. So much more than Cholulu guy, whatever his name is.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely love that Cholulu guy.
Sorry, everyone loves him, but I think Blackwood is so much more. My God.
One of the worst things I ever did was I read Algernon Blackwood, and then I went and tried to read Lacey's story by Stephen King. And it was like, talk about a difference in understanding how to be economic and smart with words and beautiful with words. And to me, Algernon Blackwood, he does this thing that I kind of believe in, which I think is kind of where you're going with your films, which is that the nature of nature is that we know so little of nature. We are part of nature. First off, we talk about it like it's something over in the corner.
I agree. It's disgraceful.
And it's supernatural. We know so little about, we don't need supernatural. Nature, we know so little of it. If we go far enough into the woods, we're going to find the centaur, and it's not going to be supernatural. It's going to be something that was there the entire time. And so our characters, or your characters, make choices that threaten the natural order consistently. And then the natural order comes and threatens them, whatever that nature might be. Sometimes it's medical. Sometimes it's the crazy redneck hunter that's out in the boonies. Or even better, the thaw. Just the idea of the thaw, which, the last winter is just crazy phenomenal.
Have you read The Willows?
Oh, yes.
I mean, that's one of the most bizarrely spooky films. I read that all the time, and I still don't know what happens.
Yeah.
It's so upsetting.
I did a 2-hour version of it so back in the day, the Christmas fair horror thing used to be the big thing in England. They would do a Christmas ghost story. So this year for my podcast, I did a dramatization of The Willows. Nice. And people were writing me going, "Oh my God, that was absolutely insane." And I was like, "Yeah, but can you tell me what happens?" I mean, just the idea of being lost. If you've ever been lost in the woods, Blackwood hits you right between the eyes of how that feels. And I actually think I used to love the Wendigo more, but I think the Willows, just for its subtlety.
The Willows is better. Yeah. And you know what else? There's a third one. If I Had to Desert Island, and I can never remember the title. The Sense of Snow.
Smilla's Sense of Snow.
Is that what? No, see, that's what I always get confused.
Okay.
That's a movie with a whole other title. I'm going to find it before we finish, but it's so incredible. It's this guy who he's at a resort, and he goes up and he goes skating, and he meets this woman, and they're skating together. And then he becomes sort of obsessed to keep joining her. Read it tonight, dude. It's, of course, very short, and it's in most of the collections.
Oh, that's wonderful. I can't wait to take a look at it. I don't know it by what you've said, so I'm kind of...
I haven't told the name properly. It's embarrassing. I mean, it's one of my favorite stories. I have no idea what it's called.
That happens to me, believe me, all the time.
The snow story, whatever that is.
The thing with the guy with the hat.
Yeah, the thing with the thing, over here, and then that other thing happens. Come on.
So I guess before we end, I know that I asked for an hour. We're over. Are you okay with 5 minutes?
I'm having a lovely time.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I hate to over-encroach. But
not at all.
I want to talk a little bit about Glass Eye Pix, the legacy it's there. Obviously, your art that you've created for yourself to give all of us. Thank you for that. But I think there's something really amazing about what you've been doing for new writers and directors and sound designers and musicians. All this stuff ends up at the Glass Eye Pix area. And I kind of see Glass Eye Pix for the last decade at least, probably the most vibrant indie horror studio, especially for new talent that I can think of. And, there's so many directors that you've worked with that came out of there. It's kind of like Paris in the 20s. You have these people who are not doing, the normal thing. They're out of step with what would be the big blockbuster horror film, and they're making these small ones. How does this talent feed you? How did you get to this point? Because prior to that, you've been around. Glass Eye Pix has been around since '85, correct? About 2000, a little bit after Wendigo, is when I started seeing all these other films starting, The Roost and automatons and things like that started to come. And at one point it was like a cornucopia. I'd open up Netflix streaming or whatever, and I'd see all these films, and I'd be like, this says Glass Eye Pix, this says Scare Flicks, these are the same. Wow, look at all these amazing low budget films. How did this happen, and how does it feed you?
I've always, you can only do so much with your own vision, and yet I love the horror genre, but I love sort of certain types of movies. I work with Kelly Reichert, who's now a world-class director, and I mentored her. There's nothing in her world that is about horror, but it is about the details and leaning in and sort of asking you to look more closely, and the pacing that she brings to her stories interests me. Then you have Rick Alverson, who's a really maniacal, strange director, and I've really supported him, though once again, some of these people just pass through Glass Eye and we have one or two encounters, and that's cool. And I feel like for a brief moment I help them assert their vision. My real agenda is to work with artists and sort of let them assert a certain worldview and also an aesthetic perspective that really resonates and that is unique. And then it can, very often they'll graduate, because I'm not good at raising money. So it's not like I could be their studio, or for that matter, even their producers, because I only got so much time. I was very lucky. The early Glass Eye movies were all done with this group of Peter Polk, Brent Kunkel. They were producers, and they were sort of in a circle of people that included Graham Resnick, Ty West. And then from that, I met Jim Mickle in another way. And then there's sort of outliers like Joe Maggio. I still write with him. He made a great film called Bitter Feast, my first encounter with Josh Leonard. So on it goes. And in a case like that, I challenged Joe, who I knew to be a filmmaker who could make a feature film that sold to IFC for $6,000. So I was like, Joe, find your inner demons and let's make some kind of a horror film. And he made a movie about what was our version of torture porn at the time, like a chef who gets torpedoed by a critic, and so he decides to chain the critic in the basement and torture him. So it's really moment to moment. Elia Chaikin is a lesser known Glass Eye character, but she's a wonderful filmmaker. We made a movie. I'm very proud of it because it's about 9/11. And it's two Spanish guys who work at Liberty Island, and the towers go down, and what do? One of them they lose their job. One of them sells drugs, and the other guy goes to Afghanistan, and then sort of their relationship is ruined. It's a beautiful, soul-sensitive movie, once again, about the details and about Elia's vision and her ability to make movies at a low budget. So, and then there's certain documentaries I've supported. One about Romero.
Yeah, love that one.
Came in late, but I was very, I think, helpful in getting that sort of across the finish line. So, I hate to say it, it's always I think Ronald Reagan said the scariest 3 words are "we're the government" and "we're here to help," that's just distorted thinking. But I do, that's sort of my thing. I like to see how little I can do to help someone sort of find themselves and then get all the credit. Because Glass Eye is an umbrella of things. I don't have the mechanism to finance stuff and greenlight stuff, although that's exactly, with stake land and that sort of thing. I got a chunk of money from Dark Sky Films out in Chicago, wonderful company. I still work with them now and again. We must have made 7 movies together, but they gave me a slate, and then I just figured out the best way to spend that money and to bring in some artists. So I went to Jim Mickle, and he had something in mind, and then we sort of built Stakeland. It was going to be a web series, and then I said, well, let's do it this way. And so it's interesting. Each project, there's different levels of engagement. Movies like Me, more recent.
Oh.
First of all, Mickey Keating was my, he came in as an intern. I mean, the funny thing is most of the people who make films at Glass Eye were my interns. Mickey came, he was the most enthusiastic kid I've ever met. I loved his, just his alacrity with filmmaking, and so I supported his projects. But Like Me was brought to the company by Jen Wexler.
Yep.
And it was a, $1.6 million movie, and we tried to find the money for a long time. And then I usually at a certain point say, okay, guys, if we're finished fooling around, let's actually make the movie. Let's see. We get $250. What's that version of this story? And we still had Addison Timlin, and we built the movie. And then the irony is that the whole point was we were going to get a film, an actor like Ray Liotta or something. And then the filmmaker said, Larry, would you play the role? And I was like, I don't know, man. If that just seems like you're really, you're throwing up your hands and you're saying, but no, he said, no, I just saw Habit again, and I really want to do it. So I said, of course. And so then we made that version of the movie.
That was an amazing, risky performance that you did. I mean, that's a disturbing and exhilarating movie. It's one of the things that I bring up to people, that horror does not have to stay in a certain way of being shot, or the narrative can only go in a certain way. I think it's crazy that we think that with all the technology that has happened, we have an entire generation of people who know Twitter and pop-ups and things like that, and YouTube, how that would not become part of the narrative. And that's what I think is amazing about that film, is that even though it went, different points of view and different visual senses and different medium are being used, I wasn't lost. I knew what was going on in it, and visually very strong. And I don't know, you rarely survive any film, but this one with one of the most reprehensible kind of characters that could possibly be done. I was like, this is courageous. This is courageous filmmaking. Yeah. And I will say that when I go to film or horror conventions, if we bring up Late Phases and Darling and Stakeland, Bitter Feast, House of the Devil, I Sell the Dead, I Can See You, which I absolutely love. Resnick was like, good for you. Wow. That's one it's one of those that I recommend to people, but I always go like this because I know that they're just not going to get it. But the people who do get it are in on it the whole way.
Absolutely. 100%. Well, that's because you recognize actual brilliance. And it's funny, we're talking about Graham. He just called me today, and we have an old project that we didn't try to make. We shot a great deal of it. And then, we thought, this could be a bigger project. And, we took some time to try to raise money and all the usual things. And he just said, let's bring it back and work with what we have and turn it into something. And I just got so jazzed. So it's nice to think of Graham going back into the lab and figuring out this thing and what we'll do with it. He's one of our great talents, of course, sound design, great writer.
I think his Halloween little short that he did with Angus Scrimm. Yum.
Yeah. Oh, Angus was a great mentor to all of us. Yeah.
It's such a great bit. But I mention all those, and that's just a few of the movies that I can think of that are part of the Glass Eye oeuvre. But what I think is really interesting is that we talked about flavor before, and there's kind of a low budget flavor that inspires, like I would have thought What We Are, or Joe Begos, The Mind's Eye, and movies like that were Glass Eye picks. Like directly, but they just have that DNA. They have a flavor and a feel, an East Coast kind of low budget independent. So it's been very inspiring. Like Ted Gagan, I don't know how close he is with Glass Eye, but I could have sworn We Are Still Here was a Glass Eye Picks film, and it's not, right? So
no, but we are all it's also a movement of people, and we're
Right.
all sort of intertwined. And I know Ted, I know Travis. It was produced by Dark Sky, which I was just talking about, which only means that, there was no money, which results in a certain type of filmmaking. But, in any case, I would love to say that we are a bigger community, actually. When we do go to the festivals, I try to stay at home, but when we're out and about, we do know each other. And Sam Zimmerman, who's now at Shudder, even though that's an institution of sorts, it's still, there's a feeling of a connection there. So it's a bigger community than Glass Eye, and hopefully we all have our part to play in this moment in history.
Well, I feel that it is. As I've mentioned before, going to conventions, the movies that we bring up outside of, the big budget ones, the hardcore guys that stay up till 4:00 in the morning talking about horror movies and horror philosophy, these are the movies that we talk about. And so thank you very much for the art that you've given us, and allowing people like Jen Wexler to make the Ranger, which I champion a lot. And I get into a lot of arguments over these movies, but I think that they're all a lot of fun. And I think that they are taking horror. I mean, later on, you get Your Next and things like that from these very humble beginnings. And I think that they are helping sway horror in a more viable and useful and enjoyable path than just the normal thing that you would traditionally find. I think the Orchard has its spot. A24 has its spot, and Glass Eye most certainly has a firm grasp. And I'm waiting to see what the next pieces are going to be. But I've taken up a ton of your time. Larry Fessenden, I want to thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, thank you, Scott. It was fantastic. Really enjoyed it.
Wonderful. Can you tell the audience where they can see Depraved on Friday, September 13th?
I insisted that we open on Friday the 13th. How fun is that? Well, I don't know. Go to depravedifc.com, I guess, and they will tell you what city, because the cool thing is to see it in a theater, and it is playing all over the nation. But it's also streaming, so if you have a big screen, that's good enough. Just enjoy the movie and play it loud.
I will say that watching it, I need to see it in the theater. Especially for some of the dialogue towards the end, there are just moments where there's almost like a wistful whisper, and you know that seeing it in a theater with the voices surrounding you is going to be so much better than what I ended up having here, which ain't bad. It's not bad, but it's not seeing a movie.
You get by.
I get by with the kind of stuff that I got.
What can I do?
But yes, if you're in LA, Santa Ana, Eugene, Oregon, Denver, Colorado, El Paso, Texas, Lubbock, Austin, Kansas City.
No excuse. Come on.
You're going to see this thing. You're going to love it. And I also just want to thank you again for coming on the show. Thank you for your art. And I want to thank everyone who's listening for taking the time to do so. Feel free to email me with your own thoughts about today's episode. And until the next time, stay hell-bent. And we're out.